Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out on this blustery afternoon for our program on Man Ray and collaboration. It's very bright up here. My name is Stephen Pinson. I'm curator of photographs here at the Met, and I'm the co-curator of the exhibition Man Ray, When Objects Dream. I want to thank everybody in public programs, especially Mariana Siciliano and Isaac Poole for putting this program together this afternoon. And I'd also like to thank my co-curator, Stephanie D'Alessandro, from the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, who could not be here today, and Michaela Bransfield, who was the research associate for the exhibition. Before welcoming our speakers to the stage, I just wanted to give a brief overview of the exhibition, perhaps as a refresher for those who have already seen it, and I hope as an enticement for those who have not yet visited. The exhibition, of course, focuses on the American artist Man Ray, who was born as Emanuel Radnitsky in Philadelphia in 1890, raised in Brooklyn, New York as Manny, and adopted the name Man Ray as a young artist working between Manhattan and New Jersey before moving to Paris in 1921. He stayed in Paris for the rest of his career, except for about a decade after the outbreak of World War II, when he spent about 10 years in Hollywood before moving back to Paris, where he died in 1976. Man Ray, of course, is a very well-known artist, perhaps mostly for singular works. You might know him from objects like the flat iron studded with tacks known as cadeau or gift, or perhaps his fashion photographs like L'Âme or Glass Tears, which originally appeared as an ad for smudge-proof mascara, or perhaps for his most famous photograph, Le Violon d'Ingres. It's also, though, true that he remains something of an enigma because it's hard to make sense of his work as a whole. The proposal of When Objects Dream is to see the rayograph as a through line to weave together his work from the 1910s through the 1920s. So what is a rayograph? You might know it better by its more common name as a photogram, but it is a unique photograph made without a camera by placing objects on or near a sheet of light-sensitive paper in a dark room, exposing it to light, and then developing the image. Now, this can be quite simple, I should know, because I've tried to make them myself. And you probably have made them too as children by making something like a sun print, where you take blueprint paper, put an object in it, and take it out into the sun, and you get a shadow or an image of that object. Or it can be quite complicated and sophisticated, as Man Ray made them, by placing objects not only on the paper, but above the paper, in front of the paper, shining light from different directions, making multiple exposures, and then moving objects or replacing them between those exposures. So then it becomes something that's not just a record of an object or objects, but something more akin to painting with light, or an assemblage, or installation, or even a performance. Our discoveries about the connections between the rayograph and works in other media appear throughout the exhibition. For example, the relationship between what he called aerographs, or airbrush paintings, where he used an airbrush or air gun to deposit aerated paint around the shape of objects, which has an obvious connection to the way that he was using light and objects in the rayograph. Or by illuminating a series of previously unstudied paintings that Man Ray made in 1923, a year after he supposedly gave up this sticky medium of paint in order to pursue the rayographs, and their connection to the formal qualities of those rayographs. And these works that he did in 1923 culminated in this pair that you see on the screen from 1925 and 1926, respectively, that are both now referred to by the title of Swedish landscape. And especially the rayograph helped us to better understand Man Ray's most iconic work, Le Violon d'Ingres, which features, of course, Alice Prynne, also known as Kiki de Montparnasse, about whom we'll hear more in just a few minutes. Unlike an earlier version of the work, a smaller photograph in which Man Ray actually applied those sound holes to Kiki's back with ink, in this he used a stencil rayograph technique that he referred to as a rayo photo, and it's presented in the exhibition alongside several examples of rayographs that feature Kiki in profile. We had a very specific idea of how we wanted to present the works in the exhibition to show the interrelationship of work in various media from the 1910s through the rayograph and ending with the development of solarization with Lee Miller in 1929. And if you look on the screen, you can see a schematic design of the layout of the exhibition in which the various sections are spread around this core area that features the rayograph in the center, with the idea being that visitors can go between the various sections of the exhibition. And even in the introduction to the exhibition that you see here on the right of the screen, there is a window into that heart of the gallery as you enter the show. This is emphasized in the installation of the exhibition with these long vistas and these cross-media views, and I just want to say thank you to the brilliant design team that we had to work with here at the Met that were really partners and collaborators, specifically liking to call out Linson Chai, Kamoki Saladum, and Jordan Ferguson, who each helped us with the installation design, the graphics, and the lighting. Today, however, we're here to shift our focus a little bit away from Man Ray and to focus on three remarkable women who worked with Man Ray during the period under consideration in the exhibition. I will introduce all three of our terrific speakers at once before welcoming them to the stage. I should point out that we're seeing these three remarkable women here on the screen. Kiki de Montparnasse, of course, on the left in noir et blanche. Berenice Abbott in the center. We're able to see her in the film Return to Reason. This is in great part due to a restoration of the film that we're featuring in the exhibition itself. And then, of course, Lee Miller on the right in this beautiful solarized portrait. Now to our speakers. Mark Brody is the author of 4 books of nonfiction, including Kiki Man Ray, Art, Love, and Rivalry in 1920s Paris, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and a New Yorker Best Book of the Year. Mark has been a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University, a visiting fellow at the American Library in Paris, and a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. His latest book, The Typewriter and the Guillotine, about the New Yorker writer Janet Flanner, comes out next January. Julia Van Haften is the author of Berenice Abbott, A Life in Photography, which was shortlisted for both PEN America and Lambda Literary Awards. In 1980, she was the founding curator of the New York Public Library, curator of photography at the New York Public Library, where she also organized a major touring exhibition of Abbott's work. From the mid-1990s, she was instrumental in furthering digital initiatives for internet access to visual collections, first at NYPL and later at the Museum of the City of New York. Julia is currently compiling a documentary memoir about photography at NYPL. And just on a personal note, I also was a curator of photography at NYPL after Julie was there. And I know what terrific work she did. Hilary Flo is Senior Curator, Modern and Contemporary British Art at Tate Britain in London. She is lead curator of the recently opened Lee Miller Retrospective, which will tour next year to the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris and the Art Institute of Chicago. A specialist in 20th century modernisms, she holds a doctorate in art history from the University of Oxford. Her past curatorial affiliations include the Barbican Center and the Hepworth Wakefield. Now please join me in a warm round of applause for our guests as Mark makes his way to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Stephen and Stephanie, for this fabulous show. Wow, I'm really honored to be here, sharing the stage with Hillary and with Julia, and thank you to the staff of the Met for making me feel so welcome, and thank you to you all for being here. This is such a lovely crowd. So, about a decade ago, I started teaching these seminars on the history of Paris. My favorite week was always the 20s. I got to talk about this great explosion of art and culture in that time and place. And when I got to talking about the surrealists, I would put up this image to get the conversation started and say something, here's this Man Ray iconic picture of a woman whose nude back has been marked up with the F-holes of a violin. And about the woman in the picture, I would say that her name was Kiki de Montparnasse. She was the best-known artist model of her time and place, and romantically linked with Man Ray at the time of this image's creation, because that's really all I knew about her, so it's all I would say. As I did a few iterations of this course, and I got to looking a bit more at this image and thinking about what was going on in this room on that day, it got to bothering me that I didn't know more about her, so really for the sake of a better lecture, I started digging. And then, as so often happens, once you start peeling away just even the first layer of received knowledge, I realized, I had the story quite wrong. In fact, the few hundred people who would have first seen this image in Paris when it was printed in this proto-surrealist magazine, if they were talking about icons, would have said, oh, there's our icon Kiki, the icon of our neighborhood, the icon of our scene, the icon of our era. She was, at that time, the better-known figure within this little enclave of bohemians in Montparnasse in Paris. And that for me to describe her simply as model and romantic partner of Man Ray was really to miss the point of who she was and what she did quite badly. And so my hope today is really that if I share a little bit about who she was and what she did, I might convince you by the end of my talk that knowing a bit more about her life might help us to think about that image you just saw and others that she created with Man Ray in a slightly different way, and also maybe by extension to think about categories such as artist and muse and photographer and sitter as slightly more porous than we might at first think. She was born à l'Isprén in this little village of Châtillon-sur-Seine, a few hours by train now from Paris in the southeast. Really at a time, though, when to be born even just a few hours outside of Paris was to occupy a completely different universe. This is a place very agrarian, very traditional, its own folkways, its own kind of accent and even language variation of French. Her mother, Marie, had her at 18 and unwed and was sent up to Paris to escape the scandal of that birth, leaving Alice at the time, to be raised by her grandmother alongside 5 cousins who were also all born out of wedlock as well. And now here's Kiki as an adult. She was a lifelong illustrator. Looking back on her schooling, you see her as the dunce in the corner. Her schooling ended at 12 because she was legal to work and was sent to join her mother in Paris to start earning some money. And they were in the working class neighborhood of Montparnasse, where Alice had a series of jobs, all sort of menial labor. Here we see her at a winemaker's, most of them related to the First World War, which coincided with her teenage years. By the time she's about 18, 19, she starts to pose. She starts modeling. It's another job. One that she really liked, though, because it put her in the realm of the art world. She knew that she wanted to live a life filled with art, filled with creativity, and freedom of expression. She didn't quite know how she would do that, but posing was a way in. And the way to pose in Paris at that time was to make your way into the back room of a few of the cafes, most notably the Rotonde, where, even though it's quite an informal setting, there's a fairly formal and rigid marketplace of painters meeting models and models meeting painters, and each one trying to bring something to the table. And what Kiki, who, by this point was going by the nickname Kiki, brought to the table was this very unconventional look. So we see her here with this bobbed haircut, which we now think of as this ubiquitous flapper 20s cut. At the time that she was first sporting this, in 1919, 1920, you have to picture her like the first punks with safety pins in their ears down in the Bowery or in London in the 70s. She really was a punk. there's evidence of women being beaten and in some cases murdered by husbands and fathers for cutting their hair short. In these years, so anxious was the French state about the upheaval of gender roles in the wake of the First World War and this desperate return to order. Anything that seemed to be threatening that return was deemed dangerous. So she was quite dangerous in her look. And the painters of Montparnasse competed to capture her on canvas. That was Moïse Kisling. We see here Maurice Menjiski. Not terribly well known now, but major figures at the time and place. And both Eastern European Jews, which gives credence and evidence to the fact of Paris's cosmopolitanism. Montparnasse, this neighborhood, was really open to people from all over, and France in the 20s welcomed more immigrants than anywhere else in the world, and I think that's not coincidental with its rise as this great cultural hub of innovation. She posed for Modigliani. We don't know exactly which painting of his shortly before his death. One of her big breaks, and the break for the artist who painted her, came in 22 with this reclining nude by Suguharu Fujita, who spoke quite lovingly in a memoir about their session together. He said that on the first day, she arrived, took off her clothes, sat at his easel, pointed for him to go sit down, drew his portrait, collected her pay, put her clothes back on, walked out the door. And he loved that. And then they got on as usual the next time. But he said, I was never sure who was the author of this picture, myself or her. He talked about her sort of wild and anarchic spirit coming through in the picture, and he put his money where his mouth was when he sold this picture to the state in the 22 salon for a pretty hefty sum. He split the proceeds with Kiki. So it's about this time that she meets, there's the great portrait that she sold at the cafe hours after doing it. It's about this time she meets Man Ray, late 21, early 22, and it gives me an excuse to show this beloved archival image of young Manny across the river in Brooklyn for his bar mitzvah picture. So he's about 30, she's about 20, and he's come to Paris with the idea that he's going to be there for a few months to meet some friends, meet people like Tristan Tzara, photographed here, some of the Dadaists, see the museums, return back to Manhattan to make his way as a modern artist. But as Stephen said, that got derailed. He wound up there for decades, save for the Second World War. And that's because he met Kiki. They met at a cafe, and the night he met her, he said, I want to take your picture. Just as a painter would paint you, I want to photograph you. And she wasn't sure about that. She said, a painter can always put some poetry into a body or a face. Photography is too documentary. These were her words. And she didn't want nude pictures of her spread around town. He assured her, no, I am a painter. I paint with shadow and light. And the pictures will be tasteful. And they came to an understanding. They had a session together in Man Ray's sort of ratty hotel room on the right bank. And by both of their accounts, it was kind of a disaster, the first session. Here's some evidence of that one. She felt she was posing too stiffly. He was distracted. There was some tension in the air, awkward. They tried again a few days later. That time they took no pictures at all and wound up in bed. And so started a relationship that was tempestuous, sometimes violent, but I think ultimately quite energizing, galvanizing for both of them, that lasted for the better part of the 20s, where they lived and worked side by side. And so in the 20s, that time of where the rayographs, we see some of them, and this great explosion of images, some of his most indelible images are being created. Man Ray is really busy. He's doing commercial photography, he's doing event photography, he's doing portraits, he's doing fashion work, magazine work. More than anyone else, he is shooting Kiki, and she has this great patience with them, this openness. They're both sort of learning their roles. She's seeing what works in front of the camera, he's seeing what works behind the camera, different lighting, different posing. There's hundreds of these shots in his archive. A lot of them involve sort of these theatrical, costumed kind of looking experimentations with Kiki trying on different persona. Here we see her as Marianne, the female embodiment of France with the Phrygian bonnet. And She's also there for the birth of the rheograph. I'm showing a few that are here at our exhibition. But to focus on Kiki, this period of the early 20s when Man Ray is really exploding is also her time where she really comes into her own. And that happens at a little club called The Jockey. We see a group here out front of The Jockey, Man Ray crouched and Kiki behind him. They had kind of like an open mic night, and Kiki one night screwed up the courage and had a bunch of whiskey and got on stage and started singing. And what she sang were songs from her village. She was someone who, though she lived in Paris since she was 12, always described herself as a cultereuse, which translates literally as a dirt ass. We might say a yokel or a bumpkin. That's how she called herself. She always identified it as someone from this little village, and she sang village songs. And yet she mixed it up with this. She took a bit of that country bumpkin personality and idioms and folk songs and rolling her R's in ways that sounded strange to Parisian ears, and combined it with this ultra-sophisticated, hyper-confident character of Kiki de Montparnasse, who was somewhat obscene, very sexual, and as I said, very confident. And it was the mix of the two that really caught the public's attention. And really within a few nights in real time, she's creating this larger-than-life version of herself. I don't have shots from her from the 20s at The Jockey, but here she is a little later in the decade, and then into the 30s performing elsewhere. But it was really, as I said, this character of Kiki caught the public's attention. Her big hit at the club was about a Lothario who specialized in seducing would-be nuns and kind of deflowering them and taking them off their chosen path. And the line was, when they're lying in my bed, they'd rather hold my little head than a candle for the Virgin. And Kiki would deliver these lines and kind of wink and gesture, and it's cabaret, right? So that's how she starts. And then what happens, like today, when you make a splash on stage, film comes calling, and France had a very robust film industry in the 20s. So she's quite quickly put into commercial fare, playing some version of the Kiki de Montparnasse character. A dancer, a cabaret performer, and sometimes an artist muse. And alongside that, she's doing work with her friends. Fernand Léger, Man Ray had a hand in this as well, with the avant-garde performances caught on film. Notably, several films with Man Ray, some of which, all of which were shown here over the weekend. Again, playing this sort of femme fatale character. So now she's on stage, she's acting. When she was credited in the commercial films, she always demanded to be credited as Kiki Man Ray or Kiki Ray, seeing herself and Man Ray as a single entity, though in fact Man Ray was still married to a woman in America, but that is a story for another time. And so now she's got time on her hands, a little bit of change in her pocket for the first time really in her life. She's in her 20s. She starts to paint. And she does these paintings which to my eye look like a little bit of an extension of the Kiki character. They're idealized, romanticized versions of her life in her village, the kinds of entertainments she would have enjoyed there. Here's one of what she titled A Gypsy Caravan, things that she would have seen as a young girl. And she has a show in 27 and sells out all of her paintings, 36. It's quite a hit. And people take the work quite seriously. There's a collector named Henri Pierre Rocher, one of the great collectors of the 20th century, who buys several of her works, and in his diary says, these are like Matisses, these are super Matisses, he says. The Sleeping Gypsy, Henri Rousseau, which hangs in the MoMA, Rocher sold that and took the proceeds from that sale and bought Kiki's. So here's the announcement for her show, Kiki and also her name Alice Prin. So now she's famous, in Paris. Famous for being famous. So much so that she merits inclusion in a British Pathé film reel about Paris, being sculpted in real time by Alexander Calder. And this all is capped by the publication of her memoirs in 29, a life story. She's not yet 30. But really this unlikely tale of this woman with no connections, no money, who makes her way to the center of the avant-garde. And again, an extension of the Kiki character. It's very naked and open writing about sex, about food, about struggle, alcoholism, drug use, suicide attempts. And it is front page news in Paris, widely reviewed, well-reviewed, shortly followed by an English translation, also published in Paris, with an introduction by Mr. Hemingway, who wrote only 2 introductions in his entire life. And he also had great things to say about Kiki, comparing her to Virginia Woolf and the work of Daniel Defoe. What I want us to think about with the memoir are 2 things. First of all, as I said, kind of an extension of this both private and public life for wide consumption in a different medium. So now you could see her on stage, you can see her paintings, you can see her on film, you can read about her in these great interviews in various newspapers, and now you have the book. So, presenting her life as this kind of ongoing saga or serial that you can consume in various media, we might call her today a multimedia artist, a multi-hyphenate. Reviews of my book sometimes called her a reality star among the surrealists 100 years before the Kardashians. The second thing about the memoirs that I think is important for today is that she talks about her life as a performer, and it becomes quite clear that she is very accomplished and confident on stage. She says, on stage, I'm like the conductor of a train. I can take this crowd anywhere I want. I can see who needs to be drawn out, and I'll play to him. I can see who needs a laugh, and I'll tell her a joke. Really knows what she's doing on stage. And why I mention that is because I think it helps to think about some of the images she made with Man Ray as performances that were documented, and so a bit more of a collaborative way of looking at these works. Here is quite literally a little play, Man Ray and Kiki pretending to be Prostitute and John down in Nice, and then a couple of their friends standing in as well. Even these iconic images, you can look at as little bits of theater, and we have evidence with these shots of different variations, of different attempts at what pose is going to work. And so too with Le Violon d'Ingres, alternate shots, and then finally getting together for the one that works. And coming full circle to this image, one of the classic ways to read this image is by the title, Le Violon d'Ingres, refers to Ingres, the 19th century painter, and he had this hobby of playing a violin when you came for a studio visit, and it drove people nuts because he was really bad. And so to say an Ingres' violin is like a hobby horse. So the idea here is the woman in the picture is like a hobby, like a little instrument to strum and then pass along. But remember, of course, Kiki is the musician among the pair and the performer among the pair. And so maybe she is instrument and player. Maybe there is a bit of a duet going on here, perhaps a duel. Kiki late in life said, I was the one who gave Man Ray his genius. It was me. He understood my body. He understood my type. And so if she inspired him in this traditional way that a muse might inspire an artist, I'd also like to think of the ways that she pushed him as a rival. It's quite clear that she drove him a little bit nuts with her own art making. He refused to come see her at the Jockey. He boycotted her show. He demanded that she pose only for him, and then lost his mind when she broke that command. And they, in fact, broke quite badly on the eve of the very night before the publication of her memoirs. And yet, he writes quite lovingly about her in his memoir as one of his first great loves, held on to every one of her clippings, including for those shows that he missed, and took many, many pictures of her artworks, which he also kept among his personal archives until his death. I was quite delighted to see in 22 that this image sold at auction for a record-setting price. And we see here the coverage of the Wall Street Journal, which was echoed in all the other major outlets. And of course, I can't fault the Journal for this language, because it's the same language I used. If she was described as Kiki, nude woman model. But now she has her revenge. She's here at the Met. She is named, explained, contextualized. I saw the writing next to the Le Violon d'Ingres has her as performer and as model, and yet at the same time also, I think, as she would have liked, idealized, described in the press around the show as both the exhibition's showstopper and a 20th century Mona Lisa. Thank you for your time. Good afternoon.
Hi, I'm Julie Van Haften, and I am delighted to be here, and I thank my non-colleague but successor at the New York Public Library for inviting me, and Isaac Poole for his great public program staff for getting us underway. I'm going to read, unlike Mark, because otherwise I will wind up talking for hours. Man Ray and Berenice Abbott enjoyed amusement and a collaboration in the earliest years of their friendship from 1920 in New York City. After 1926, and animosity on Man Ray's part, it became a matter of influence and adaptation. I'll quote Berenice's voice directly from her 1976 oral history and other sources. But as her dealer, Harry Lunn, told me from my biography, with Berenice, you don't get everything. Man Ray played a role in each of these three areas of Berenice's photographic work, either directly or unwittingly: portraiture, New York City, and her science work. She lived long enough, until 1991, to receive one of the very first awards for significant photographic achievement from the nascent APAD organization. And here we see Berenice as a high school kid in Ohio, and later in New York's Greenwich Village. She grew up in a fractured, unambitious Ohio family, but she aspired to a larger world. After high school, she met older progressive students and artists at Ohio State University who opened that whole new world to her. After 2 semesters, she joined these friends who had gone to New York City in Greenwich Village and gotten involved in the avant-garde Provincetown Players. After one walk-on part in Eugene O'Neill's Moon of the Caribbees, Berenice came down with the Spanish flu. She was lucky. Others in the troupe died. Through that association, she met other New York literary modernists, such as Juna Barnes, the Little Review Crew, the Malay family, and most especially the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, who became a mentor. When Berenice recovered by mid-1919, she returned to her life of odd jobs, which included modeling, and in one notable instance, a film extra with Norma Millay and others as Greenwich Village characters, for which she earned $10 a day for a half a day's work, money that could keep her going for weeks. This movie was Philistine among Bohemians after the O. Henry story. The work could be rough being an extra, as novelist Dawn Powell wrote about a different movie. This movie life is no cinch. I never saw such a group of absolute moral degenerates as those movie extras. But it was the Baroness who encouraged Berenice in her switch from journalism to sculpture, so that by April 1920, Berenice had told the US Census that her occupation was artist. Elsa also encouraged Berenice to work as a model for artists, as she had done at OSU. I was younger than everybody else. I ran into all these artists, she said, and they got me interested in these things. but she never took classes. I was just doing it. I just grew like Topsy from inside out. You know, the work, it was very therapeutic for me, and I think in a way it gave me an anchor. You have to be interested in something. Really, you have to. Oops. After the literary crowd and recovering from the flu, she ran into Man Ray in one of the cafes. He approached her to take pictures, but she quickly proved not only a non-romantic quarry, unlike the other two women in today's program, but she was very wary about being posing nude, even though she probably had done that at OSU. In any event, he took a portrait of her, which was published and known as Portrait of a Sculptor. It was awarded a prize in a Wanamaker department store competition that was judged by Alfred Stieglitz. At one point, we can see that she gave up her concern about posing nude for Man Ray and did that. But she remained a little mascot to all these older artists. She recalled visiting Alfred Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe with Man Ray in New York, where she termed herself Little Miss Foot in It for praising Man Ray to the two of them, although obviously he was well known. This series of nudes is mysterious. It's in an album that Arturo Schwartz, the great collector of Man Ray work, acquired, and it's now in the Israel Museum. They may have been studies for Berenice to show other artists how she could take dramatic and exotic poses, because modeling was really how she made her living at that point. In 1968, Berenice told the collector, Arnold Crane, "See, I knew him before I worked for him. We were buddies in New York, he and Marcel Duchamp and I." And that was another great boon for Berenice, that she met Marcel Duchamp through Man Ray. "I was a kid. I was a crazy kid, and we were very close friends. And we used to go out to dance halls. And once Man Ray and I were put off the floor for doing obscene dancing. Well, we weren't doing obscene dancing. He was just awkward, and I was trying to teach him. And I suppose we looked awkward, and maybe somebody thought we even looked obscene." To Neil Baldwin, Man Ray's biographer, she wrote that she and Man Ray and Duchamp would go out drinking, dancing, and, quote, toot around the village and have fun. In her oral history, she wrote, "We were good friends. Duchamp gave me some pieces of chessmen to cast," which we see his originals over on the far left. "And I would cast and do things like that. And so he gave me some little things to do for him." She probably picked up the technique from Jig Cook, who was one of the directors of the Provincetown Players, who was casting props and also had that as a hobby. "He also admired my work," she said, "which gave me the greatest boost, you know, like air to breathe." So we were good friends, and we used to dance. In the center is one of the extant pictures of one of Berenice's now lost sculptures. There are no other sculptures by her. This was a little one known as Lady with a hoop skirt and was also cast in the plasticine material. In 1920, Duchamp wrote to his brother-in-law in France about producing a chess set cast in plaster mixed with glue. "I'm about to launch on the market a new form of chess set. They will be made out of cast plaster mixed with glue, which will make them as sturdy as wooden pieces. I will send you a set as soon as it's ready, and you can experiment with it." Although this came to no fruition, Duchamp obviously continued his chess playing, but the commercial sale of this went bust. Meanwhile, Paris was in the air, and on the far right, we see Berenice's passport application from January 1921, and she's vouched for by Man Ray. There was no other relative who would take it on, and he said he knew her for 5 years instead of the possible 18 months that they had actually known each other. You'll also notice that Berenice is still spelling her name with only 2 E's, and it wasn't until she met Duchamp that she adopted the 3rd E. After they sailed in March, Berenice sailed in March, this picture appeared in the one and only issue of New York Dada. There's speculation on who is the actual model, whether it was Elsa, the Baroness, or Berenice. I think from the previous nudes, we can put together some sort of sense that this is probably Berenice's body. I think the Baroness was much too much of a show-off to cover her face ever in a picture and have her only her body show, where Berenice was probably a little more circumspect about accepting the playful role of one stalking and standing behind a mannequin if her face was not going to be published. But the quote that's printed here shows that Berenice was still a very close confidant and associate of Duchamp and Man Ray. The quote is from probably a telegram that Duchamp wrote to Man Ray as they were both en route to Paris that July, warning that Berenice is down south. She was at the farm of girlfriend of André Gide and was going to be coming back to Paris in time to meet with them. That's the quote I'm talking about. The picture on the right is a photograph of Berenice's face, the second one that I'm aware of after the one that won the prize, where Berenice recalled sitting on a trunk in Man Ray's hotel room soon after he arrived in the city, where he was simply testing a lens. As she continued to pose for him, even though she had gone to Berlin in the fall of 1921 and explored staying there to practice her sculpture there, away from the distractions she felt of cafe life in Paris. Man Ray, by this time, was looking for a much larger studio, and the very familiar picture that we've seen is where he eventually wound up for some stretch. Now, ultimately, it was Man Ray who had the greatest influence on Berenice after she abandoned sculpture and Berlin and returned to Paris when funding from a potential patron never came through in fall 1922. Man Ray was by then making a very successful portrait photography business just to bring in money, while he still considered himself a painter who had begun to experiment artistically with his photographic materials. And here we see one of his rayograms. Across a cafe table in spring 1923, Berenice carried on about how she could never afford to be the artist she wanted to be, while Man Ray complained about his latest studio assistant, a man who knew it all and could not be taught Man Ray's methods. In her 1976 oral history, Berenice recalled, "So I said, why not me? I needed a job, and how? I didn't care. If it had been a bricklayer, I would have said the same thing." And he said, "Why not?" He offered 15 francs a day, same as she could make modeling, and I was in seventh heaven. I could survive on that. The minute we began printing, I liked it. So Man Ray took Berenice on as his darkroom assistant in the damp, red-lit dark with the trays and the chemicals, which she took to, she said later, like a duck to water. He used the rayogram technique to show her how photographic materials behaved. She became super proficient at interpreting the negative image, she said, because her sculptural sensibility allowed her to feel the plasticity of a portrait as it came up in the developing tray. Within 2 weeks, Man Ray said, "You make better prints than I do." And he raised her salary to 25 francs a day. I had been a pretty headstrong independent kid, she said, and I was so glad to get this job that I said to myself, "You've got to make this go. Sister, you have to make this go." She said she worked for Man Ray like a dog. I made the prints, hung them up, straightened them out, spotted them, and mounted them. Of course, in those days, we didn't do any dry mounting at all, just a little sliver of glue on the top, and stuck them on the mount. The fee for a sitting was 1,000 francs for negatives and proofs. Prints were additional, which was a lot of money in those days in Paris. It was then fashionable for well-to-do tourists to have their portraits taken. Berenice's stamina and work ethic enabled her to produce great quantities of the commercial portrait pictures that paid for Man Ray's lifestyle and studio. For some huge print orders, she would stay up all night, so the clients would take the work with them when their boat sailed. Eventually, it was too much. When she got him, quote, "the biggest check he ever received, but he never gave me 1 franc extra." That petulance persisted in Berenice's career and is one thing that really kind of colors her otherwise sweetness and directness. Man Ray knew I should be getting more money, Berenice told collector Arnold Crane in 1968. Instead, Man Ray suggested she start taking some portraits herself on her lunch hour, for which she can charge some money. He never taught her how to take a picture, she said, but showed her the focus and lenses and advised that the camera was sort of simple to use. It's on a tripod. It stays there. In her oral history, she emphasized that she was not present when he took the pictures and taught her nothing about taking people. That it didn't occur to her to take pictures because she just wanted to do what he wanted, and wanted to do it well to keep her job. But she began shooting friends on her lunch hour when it became very popular, and soon she was using up and owing Man Ray for paper and chemicals as much as he was paying her. A break point came when Peggy Guggenheim asked to be photographed by Berenice. They had become friendly, instead of Man Ray. Simultaneously, Sylvia Beach, the great publisher of James Joyce, wanted new publicity pictures of the author because she was tired of paying Man Ray every time somebody wanted to use one of his portraits of Joyce. So Berenice had a new sitting and went into Joyce's home in 1926 and took pictures of Joyce, which didn't sit well with Man Ray either. In summer 1926, Berenice finally left him and had her own studio. She bought a lot of equipment with money from both Guggenheim and the English writer Breyer. Her June 1926 solo exhibition was introduced by a Cocteau poem, which compared her to a checkers player in black and white and called her a bird catcher, a sexless bird catcher. While a group exhibition 2 years later in 1928 said the left bank now has 2 photography masters, Berenice and Man Ray, and that didn't sit well either. I'm sorry, I wanted to go back and just make sure people understand who the first pictures on the top are subjects that sat for Berenice on her lunch hour, and eventually she took the entire Joyce family, not Giorgio, but Lucia and James and Nora. But it was Man Ray who was responsible for introducing Berenice to the Parisian photographer Atget. Berenice never forgot the first Atget photograph Man Ray showed her in 1925, for Atget's work sparked in her a, quote, sudden rush of recognition, the shock of realism unadorned. She had never seen the everyday world so visually sequestered, its features isolated and elevated for consideration. Atget was not aesthetic, she wrote. His subjects were not sensational, but nevertheless shocking in their very familiarity. The real world, seen with wonderment and surprise, was mirrored in each print. Whatever means Atget used to project the image did not intrude between subject and observer. Atget's photographs helped Berenice solidify her artistic philosophy, her belief that there is nothing so compelling as reality, no fiction so exciting as, quote, the ordinary things about us, if one only has the eyes to behold them. That was bookended by a lifetime later by her ordinary claim that the photographer's role is to, quote, select what is worthwhile to take the trouble about. Fashionable and successful, Berenice returned to New York in 1929 with the archive of the photographer Eugene Atget, comprising thousands of glass plates and original prints, which she had purchased from his executor. She segued to urban photography, only to find her prospects dashed by the Great Depression. When the Federal Art Project, a government work relief program, provided support in 1935 for her classic documentation, Changing New York, she began by photographing scenes on the Bowery, then Manhattan's Skid Row. An older male supervisor warned her that, quote, nice girls don't go there. Berenice shot back, I'm not a nice girl. I'm a photographer. I go anywhere. And here we see her New York work. She started using still the European vertical tendance style of work. Her night view reflects that to some extent. But then, and occasionally in Changing New York pictures, but it was Atget's realism that propelled her vision through that project. Man Ray surfaced again somewhat in her use of his rayogram technique when she taught photography at the New School. She was the first to start classes there at their request in 1934 and continued to teach for almost a quarter century. She opened every darkroom beginning class by demonstrating, more or less as Man Ray had showed her, how to place objects on a negative, expose the paper, develop it, and discuss tonalities, opacity, and other qualities that appear in the photographic negative and in the subsequent prints. Changing New York preoccupied her for 3 years, and when the funding began to run out, she turned to the subject of science, the salient feature of 20th century life. She photographed industrial subjects and devised imaging techniques before joining the Physical Science Study Committee, PSSC, based in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she worked from 1958 to 1960. Before she joined them, though, she had begun experimenting with wave photography, something she could do only in the darkroom, like the rayogram, but in this case, it used the developer liquid itself. She wrote in her 1953 New Guide to Better Photography, where she reproduced one of the pictures, she had the developer in the tray, and I was rocking the tray in the dark, blew off the light, in this case, a 1/200th of a second exposure, as opposed to the normal one of about 1/50th, and was amazed. Oh, I put the paper in the bottom of the developing tray, just raw paper, flashed the light, and there was a beautiful wave. So I remember that very well. The PSSC physics program was devised in the wake of America's shock at the launch of the Sputnik orbiting satellite by the Soviet Union in 1957. It was recognized that American physics needed to move into, by then, the second half of the 20th century and stop treating simply mechanical things like pulleys and refrigeration and take up the concepts of forces in light and other kinds of motion. Really, the basis for quantum mechanics needed to be taught. And this was going to be aimed at American high school students to improve high school science education. In addition to physics, there was going to be programs in biology and chemistry, but the ones for physics came the closest. Berenice had two allies on the Physical Science Study Committee, Bert Little, who had taught science at Phillips Exeter and was running the program, and an old friend, I. Bernard Cohen, who was a science historian at Harvard and had been a paramour of Berenice's 1930s friend, Muriel Rukeyser. The two of them hired her for the PSSC over the objections of the scientists on the program. Even the postdocs thought it was nuts to hire a 60-year-old arty photographer for the work. But she understood what was to be depicted, and she enjoyed working with the scientists to make it happen. So she used some of that wave technique to bring about pictures for, here we see the lab book, and here we see an exhibition of the pictures that was held at the New School in 1959. Beaumont Newhall wrote the text for the New York Times article about the show, and it moved on to the faculty lounge at MIT, where it got the first exposure to a much wider audience. People were very excited about it, and it turned into, eventually, not only the physics textbook, which used many of the pictures, much too small to get a good sense of what they were reproducing, but larger pictures that were created by the Smithsonian to tour in response to the public response to the pictures, who didn't really care much about the physics of it, but were deeply moved by just the abstract qualities and their eeriness, which irritated a lot of the scientists. And there was a lot of trouble about writing the labels because the scientists wanted them to explain the physics, and the Smithsonian didn't really care. They just wanted to show the beautiful pictures. After that, the show closed in the middle 1960s, and before the photo market actually took off. Lee Witkin didn't open his gallery until 1969. Man Ray's biography came out in 1963, and Berenice published her first book on Eugene Atget. Man Ray's mention of Berenice in his autobiography, made her mad and sad because he only mentioned encountering her in the Greenwich Village Cafe. Nothing about the 3 years that she worked for him or about going on to have a successful photographic career of her own. The Atget book, though, was part of what rankled Man Ray so much. He was always outraged that she had been able to buy the collection in 1928. He never understood where she got the money to do it. It was never known to him and barely known to people when she sold the collection finally in 1968 to the Museum of Modern Art. 2 years before that, she looked Man Ray up in the Paris telephone book, making a return trip for the first time in 30 years. She called the number, but no one picked up, and she didn't try the number again. Man Ray's resentment about the collection was just part of what was a rankle. She stayed friends on some terms with Marcel Duchamp from that era, but Man Ray and she never reconciled. I thank you enormously.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Particularly, many thanks to the Met team for their wonderful invitation. It's particularly meaningful to me because 15 years ago, I did a curatorial internship at the Met, which was very formative, and it's an honor to return in this capacity. So, without further ado, the American artists Lee Miller and Man Ray met in Paris in June 1929. She was 22 years old, and Man Ray was then the most famous photographer in the country. It was not an accident. Unannounced, but armed with a letter of introduction from Edward Steichen, for whom she had modeled in New York City, Miller pursued Man Ray to his studio. Not finding him there, she brazenly searched him out in one of the nearby bars. In her own words, she said, "My name is Lee Miller, and I'm your new student." He said, "I don't have students." He said he was leaving for Biarritz the next day, and I said, "So am I." I never looked back. This encounter and the 3 years that followed had a seismic effect on the lives and practices of both Miller and Man Ray. In a much mythologized turn of events, the two fell in love, and Miller's apprenticeship rapidly evolved into a creative partnership as they worked intimately, sometimes interchangeably, in the studio and darkroom to evolve radically new forms of representation, including what they termed solarization. As curator of the Lee Miller retrospective, now open at Tate Britain, I approached this contested chapter in Miller's work intrigued but trepidatious. On the one hand, Miller's beauty and Man Ray's fame have combined to produce sensationalized narratives of an epic love affair at the heart of modern art. Such accounts prioritize biographical readings, typically quoting liberally from Man Ray's impassioned love letters to frame Miller as the ultimate muse and femme fatale. The crescendo of this story is reached with the couple's 1932 breakup, leaving Man Ray reputedly suicidal, and Man Ray's creation of post-breakup works, including Object to be Destroyed, which he remade with her eye, and The Lovers. Needless to say, though, what I think of as the Lovers of the Century narrative felt quite unhelpful for a solo show seeking to place Miller's own photography at its heart. Another approach would have been to downplay Man Ray's role in Miller's work during this period, asserting her independent achievements. They were many. Man Ray was far from Miller's only a source of guidance and inspiration. Her father, Theodore Miller, was a serious amateur photographer. She'd grown up in a house with a darkroom and been given her first camera at an early age. She trained in avant-garde dance and theater design, was well-versed in art history, and studied painting for 2 years at the Art Students League in New York City. Moreover, years as a top model had given her the chance to work with and befriend internationally renowned photographers such as Edward Steichen, Nicholas Murray, Cecil Beaton, Arnold Genter, and Charles Sheeler, studying their techniques. Even during her apprenticeship with Man Ray, in fact, Miller was simultaneously pursuing another paid traineeship, one with a different top Paris photographer, the Baron Hoyningen-Huene, the chief photographer at French Vogue, to whom Miller had been personally recommended by Condé Nast. By mid-1930, she'd set up her own studio, taking clients and publishing images under her own name. She continued modeling at the highest levels during this period, and flouting Man Ray's wishes, she starred in Jean Cocteau's The Blood of a Poet. Many of the works she produced during this period, whether in the Vogue studio, on the set of a Paramount film, or on the streets of Paris, are independent of Man Ray in style and subject. By 1932, she was so well established in her own right that she was exhibiting internationally, and she'd taken on at least one student of her own, namely André Durst, later celebrated fashion photographer. By the time she returned from Paris to New York in autumn 1932, she was a celebrity. But while our exhibition and its catalogue celebrates these realms of achievement, it also felt vital to acknowledge the potency of her collaborations with Man Ray. Miller's most substantial statements on this subject appear in her 1975 interview, My Man Ray, published in Art in America. In the piece, she described their experimental image-making processes in detail and the shared discovery and mastery of solarization. To her husband, Roland Penrose, she described a working collaboration that was so close and intuitive that although many works have been attributed to Man Ray, with which she assisted or in fact made, she said, quote, "It doesn't matter. I can't claim anything. We were like one person when we were working." Miller's statement is provocative, unsettling conventional notions of artistic authorship. It seems rather beautifully expressed by this little-known image at the right from Man Ray's archive, a double exposure in which the two artists' shadows merge in the studio. But it does differ sharply from the accounts put forward by Man Ray in his 63 autobiography Self-Portrait, in which Miller figures, like Abbott, only briefly, as his love object, and also as Roland Penrose's future wife. And it differs also from Penrose's 1975 Man Ray biography, in which Miller is, quote, Man Ray's beautiful and inevitably provocative assistant. Miller, though, was not known for self-aggrandizement, tending to downplay her own achievements, and she was fiercely protective of Man Ray's feelings and reputation throughout her life. They'd made friends again in 1937 and remained close until their deaths. Moreover, Miller's claim is borne out in many ways, I think, by close examination of a number of erotically charged works attributed to one or the other artist. These works will concern the rest of the discussion today. So, as Miller details in her interview, Man Ray's practice was often to shoot from a distance, with the final composition or multiple compositions achieved through cropping into the image in the darkroom. The enlarger created a beautiful soft focus blur on heavy matte paper. Man Ray rarely did his own printing, and so his assistant Miller was largely responsible for developing and retouching his prints. In at least one case, this practice caused conflict between the two artists. In summer or autumn 1929, Ray took a bust-length shot of Miller, we can see at the left, brightly lit from one side, with her neck gracefully arched. He didn't like the negative and discarded it, but Miller retrieved it and labored over the production of an exquisite print dominated by her own sinuously long, curving throat in close-up. She claimed this image as her own work, and the two quarreled. Miller was kicked out of the studio and returned later to find the print slashed with red ink streaming from its neck like a wound. Man Ray seems to have won that skirmish, for he published Neck under his name alone, and until recently, art historians have largely followed that attribution. Despite this incident, which occurred very early in their relationship, Miller seems to have been largely relaxed about this fluidity of authorship. As Man Ray was the more famous and better paid artist, she noted later that by mid-1930, she began taking on some of his commissions to free him up to pursue painting. She was also instrumental in their development of solarization, so-called solarization, the Sabatier effect. Although absent from Man Ray's own accounts, Miller revealed that she'd, quote, made the initial mess in the darkroom through an accidental re-exposure of images of a female nude. She was generous, though, in crediting Man Ray with finding ways to control and master the technique, which seemed to electrify the contours of the human body. Man Ray scholars have generally identified the female nude in question as that of Susie Solidor, the cabaret singer. But it's been difficult to trace the original source for that identification. In a 1941 article by Miller, meanwhile, entitled "I Worked with Man Ray," incongruously appearing in a British humour magazine, Lilliput, Miller identifies another image entirely as that first work. She names Prima de la matière c'est la pensée, which is illustrated as a cropped, rotated version, you can see, with the heading The Girl in the Dream. So here we can also see the kind of multiple compositions that might emerge from a single negative. Miller credits the image to Man Ray alone, but her own narrative casts that into question, and she later told Penrose that the work was partially hers. Similar attribution dilemmas have bedeviled readings of a pair of images of a human head under a bell jar. They show Miller's close friend, Tanja Ram, her disembodied head placed like a scientific specimen on a chest of drawers. Man Ray's image was published under the title Hommage à Deux de Sade in 1930, and for a long time was the only known version. Like many of Man Ray's most famous photographs of women, it is celebrated as a surrealist icon, but also critiqued as an example of misogyny within the surrealist movement. The image enacts a symbolic revenge upon the female body via its fragmentation or dismemberment, according to these accounts. But when a variant print surfaced in Miller's archive after her death, we see at the right, its authorship was at first deemed unclear. Ram herself recalled Miller and Man Ray sharing the shoot, and Miller's authorship of this version is now widely accepted. Much has been made of the blindfold-like shadow across Tanja's face in Man Ray's version and its absence in Miller's, but the near-identical nature of these images certainly presents challenges to interpretations based on the presumed gender of the author. While noting the existence of such closely related works across Miller and Man Ray's corpus from this very specific time period, scholars such as Jean Gallagher and Amy Lyford have built on feminist critiques of Man Ray's nudes by highlighting perceived differences in Miller's versions. In this reading, Miller's work engages in a, quote, dialogue of dissent with Man Ray over the representation of the female body. For example, Marianne Kors had described Man Ray's photograph of Miller wearing a wire mesh saber guard over her face, which we can see at the center here, as speaking of, quote, female entrapment, a prey who is rendered simultaneously mute, and speaking of objecthood. She added, alienated from her body and from its probable representation, the model suffers. Gallagher has contrasted Man Ray's image with a version by Miller at left, in which an unknown model wears the saber guard on her arm, now, quote, a weapon rather than a prey, in Gallagher's reading. Neither address a rarely seen still life by Miller, now in the Philadelphia Museum, at right, in which the same saber guard dangles in space in a curiously illegible still life. Yet, why should Miller be seen as alienated from her own image? To the contrary, in fact, like Kiki de Montparnasse, she was a highly skilled model, and in this case, a photographer in her own right, fully capable of mobilizing her body as a form of signification. Alternative images from the same shoot reveal Miller's dynamic experimentation with her prop and posture, recalling her training as a dancer. In the published image, Miller's ferocious stare, combined with the defensive potential of the saber guard as her helmet, bears a threatening charge, in contrast, perhaps, to the serenity of her own image, in which the model presents herself without returning our gaze. The sexual politics of these images, in other words, are not clear-cut. What is certainly problematic, however, as Patricia Ulmer has noted, is the persistent assumption among scholars, without evidence, that Man Ray's version of a given type will predate Miller's version. Whether the overlap is in prop, model, technique, or concept, after all, Miller's version may have come first. It's worth noting, too, that themes of desire and danger, sexuality and power are explicitly addressed in other Miller images without a close counterpart in Man Ray's practice. A fascination with the writings and images and ideas of the Marquis de Sade was widespread among the Paris surrealists, who embraced him as a prophet of unfettered desire. Miller's archive holds a series of small contact prints of nude women in her Paris apartment, which attest to her independent exploration of sadomasochistic imagery. One here is contorted on the floor on top of an unstretched painting, which in fact is a 1913 nude on canvas by Man Ray. In another image, a woman bears a whip, partially concealed behind a curtain. And surely no surrealist work goes further in this vein than Miller's astonishing photographs of a severed breast made around 1930 when she was working for extra income, documenting surgeries in a hotel in Paris. Not a hotel, a hospital. Thank you. Sorry, it's bad enough having this image on the screen. It's really gruesome. But that was the point. After recording a mastectomy, Miller removed the organ and staged it on a dinner plate as a transgressive surrealist tableau. This remains extraordinary to me. Probing the representation of the female body as well as the link between pleasure and violence, the severed breast images were extreme even by surrealist standards, and there is no record of them being shown in her lifetime. Phew. Okay. In both Man Ray and Miller's nudes from this period, bodies mutate. Necks and backs become phalluses, bubbles become quivering breasts, female becomes male and back again, through a process of abstraction and defamiliarization. Oh, let's try again. Yes. Such uncanny bodies not only resemble genitalia, but they bear more than a slight resemblance to modern sculpture. From a rarely seen experimental film, Autoportrait, in which Miller captures Man Ray blowing quivering smoke bubbles before she provocatively unsheathes and caresses Brancusi's notoriously phallic Princess X sculpture, we can be sure that she was in on the joke. In fact, their shared delight in the erotic potential of the bubble form can be traced through numerous works by both artists, as we can see here. The phallic nature of Man Ray's necks in particular has attracted sustained critical attention. For Hal Foster, the semi-penile nature of these images speaks of male fetishism born from castration anxiety. Foster's essay acknowledges the existence of similar ambiguously phallic works in Miller's oeuvre, but like Nude Bend Forward, which we can see here, but his Freudian theories of male subjectivity do not account for them, nor indeed does he explore the potential of queer and/or female forms of pleasure in these deliriously strange erotic forms. Instead, perhaps, we may wish to follow Rosalind Krauss and others in stressing the subversive and deconstructive potential of these doubled or formless bodies, in which gendered meaning starts to come unbound. Attribution challenges surface yet again in trying to distinguish portraits and self-portraits by Miller and Man Ray in the period. Both photographed themselves and each other. Some may have been jointly conceived, staged, and/or executed. Some are signed, stamped, or published by one or the other artist, or can be found in the archive of one or the other, but these pieces of evidence are not necessarily conclusive. In Carolyn Burke's 2005 biography of Miller, for example, the unpublished portrait in the center was attributed to Man Ray. Subsequently, a cropped and enlarged variant has emerged in a private collection at right, signed and stamped by Miller, leading to both images being recognized as self-portraits. Yet it seems likely that the hand pressing the shutter was Man Ray's, just as it would have been hers in his self-portraits from the time. As we know, the headless female torso, sometimes reminiscent of a fragmented classical statue, haunts surrealist painting and photography in this time, hailed as a celebration of sensual, somatic experience, or condemned for a perceived loss of women's power and autonomy. Give them their heads, they had one. Give them their voice, they had one, cried Marianne Kors in her landmark 1991 book, Surrealism and Women, for example. Man Ray's tendency to fragment Miller's body, her anatomy, and his photography has been viewed by both of Miller's biographers as driven by an unmet desire for control and mastery in their relationship, Miller being notoriously independent. For a woman artist to explore the same iconography, especially through her own body, is highly unusual. Is there an autoerotic component to this image? Has Miller simply absorbed and reproduced the male gaze? Or does the participation in a woman artist in these iconographies signal possibilities for their recuperation? So back to the bell jars. Two hitherto unknown versions have recently come to light in a private collection, revealing both Miller and Man Ray taking their own turns as disembodied heads under the glass dome. The photographs bear Man Ray's studio stamp, but it is evident that both Miller and Man Ray took turns photographing the other before or after Tangeram. We can contrast Miller's rapt, orgasmic expression with Ram's deathly blankness and Man Ray's squinting grimace. While the versions of Ram are the most successful, arguably, not least because of their skillful printing, Miller and Ram are also notable for their professional modeling skills here, their ability to perform for the camera clearly exceeding that of poor Man Ray. But most importantly, these images provide a rare glimpse into a shared studio practice that was extraordinarily playful and fluid as cameras, props, models, and ideas ricocheted back and forth in a process of collective creativity and experiment. In the end, I think, we have to take Miller at her word, more or less, in claiming that, at least in this radically entwined body of work, attribution is not very important. It seems difficult and unproductive to pit the two artists against each other in that dialogue of dissent, based on gender or otherwise. And in general, it seems equally difficult and unproductive to seek definitive attributions for any of these works. Just as they deconstruct the sexed and gendered body, these dazzlingly beautiful, unsettling images invite us to deconstruct our assumptions about authorship. Far from detracting from either Miller or Man Ray's work, these ambiguities only add to its mystery and fascination. Thank you so much.
just want to thank our three speakers today for digging into these very complicated relationships and giving us a richer portrait of Lee Miller, Berenice Abbott, and Alice Prynne. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming out this afternoon. And please come back and see the exhibition.